And another interesting opportunity at the horizon is the prospect of carbon monetization. Because as a value chain, in a whole, you're responsible for the emissions that you generate. And a lot of the emissions are generated at the upstream. So for the animal protein value chain, that's for instance, the feed mills, the farmers. That's where, depending on the species, up to 90% of the footprint is generated.
The value of data assets and how to manage your digital transformation. That is the topic I'm going to discuss with Daan van der Zanden, Senior Manager at Deloitte, in this episode of Future Feed Talks. My name is Marieke Ploegmakers, editor all about feed, and this series is in cooperation with DSM, Firmenich, Animal Nutrition and Health. So hi, Daan, welcome here, and we're very happy to have you here and talk about your topic today. So what we talk about today is sustainability data, the challenge. So to start, can you tell me what is the challenge? What is the challenge with sustainability data?
There's a challenge, there's also an opportunity, but let's start indeed with the challenge first. And I think the big challenge with sustainability and with any of the topics that are up and coming is that you need the right data to substantiate it. And where this typically is a challenge indeed, the trick with sustainability is you need to do it across all scopes. So you have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 and 2, they're relatively straightforward, but they're also, let's say, the smallest portion of your footprint. Scope 1 is everything within your own system boundaries, your own operations. So that data is typically readily available. If you look at scope 2, that's all the electricity and heat that you purchase. So that's at least boxed, if you may. But scope 3, there it gets a bit more challenging because you don't only need your own data, you need the data of your full supply chain. So that's your customers, that's your suppliers, and that is often outside the span of control that you have.
What about sharing of data? I can imagine that's a challenge for companies and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's where the difficulty kicks in. I mean, technically it's not necessarily a hassle to get data from different parties, but the objections are in the realm of, well, if I share this data, am I then compliant with all the data sharing protocols and regulations of my organization? Or your data might be business sensitive. So do I want to share this? Do I give away my competitive advantage by sharing this information? If you bring it home to, for instance, the example of a feed mill, if you ask them to share their recipe, well, they won't be very receptive to that request because that's important IP for them. So sharing the actual data, that's often a big challenge. But what you can do to circumvent the challenge is to not look at sharing the data, but sharing the actual insights that you extract from the data.
Okay, so go a step further, like...
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and then it's less of a challenge then, because it's not the real, the raw data that you're sharing, but the insights of it.
Yeah, you're spot on. And the nice thing is that the value increases when you move from data to insights, because with the insights you can actually work. Yeah. But conversely, the business sensitivity decreases.
Okay.
Because if, for instance, you share the footprint of a feed, then you'll, well, have the information that you're looking for. That's the valuable insight. But you will not have the actual input data, and that's where the sensitivity lies. So that recipe that we were talking about, you won't have access to that.
No. Okay, clear, thank you. So why is it relevant for companies, for agri-food companies to care about this data and sustainability data?
Yeah, good question. Always start with the why indeed. And I think if you look at sustainability, it's a topic that you cannot go around. I mean, we have an increasing population that we need to feed in a sustainable way. So that's the main driver. And well, surrounding that main driver are a couple of forces that are really hammering down on the industry. So I think the most front of mind is rules and regulations. So for instance, look at CSRD, where companies are mandated to report on their emissions. That's a big driver across industries to really get on top of your game. But rules and regulations are not the only driver. Think about, let's say, sustainably conscious consumers, the value chain itself that imposes requirements, and you'll have financial institutions that will need to justify the footprint of their loan portfolio. So there's all these different forces that are asking you to be sustainable.
And what about those consumers? Because often the prices of sustainable goods are higher. So, can data help a company that consumers will buy those products?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the willingness to pay for a sustainably sourced product is definitely there. So there's, of course, a plethora of studies to underpin that. What you do see is that these are influenced by the times. A study done before the recession, for instance, showed a willingness to pay an additional amount of 5 to 10% or even upwards of 10%. And that willingness was at roughly 60 to 80% of the consumers, so quite a big share depending on where you are geographically. Yeah. If you look at more recent studies, then the willingness to pay is still there, but the extent to which consumers are ready to pay is a bit lower. So now they are willing to pay an upcharge of, let's say, 3 to 5%. So there's some variations there. But I think back to your question, why the data is relevant, you can only make a sustainable claim on your product if you have the right data to underpin it. There's been quite some hassle in the past with greenwashing claims. If you don't have the right data to credibly substantiate the claims that you're making, then you'll be in trouble. So data is an absolute necessity in this respect.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, okay, thank you. And are there any other ways that companies can unlock their value from data?
Yeah, there's, a colleague of mine said there's a mountain of opportunities, so there's plenty. And that's a nice thing, because we talked about the challenge at the start. So if you go through all the trouble of capturing your sustainability data, then, let's see if you can get the most out of it. First and foremost, we want to make the world a better place. But if there's an opportunity to unlock additional value, let's not pass on it. So let's talk, for instance, about operational efficiency. If you look at sustainability, it's often linked to performance. The more efficient you are, the less resources you use, the more sustainable you are. So you can improve your efficiency in that way. Apart from that, we talked about the financial institutions, for instance. If you have sustainable initiatives, you can get access to sustainability-linked loans that have lower interest rates. Yeah. And another interesting opportunity at the horizon is the prospect of carbon monetization. Because as a value chain, in a whole, you're responsible for the emissions that you generate. And a lot of the emissions are generated at the upstream. So for the animal protein value chain, that's, for instance, the feed mills, the farmers. That's where, depending on the species, up to 90% of the footprint is generated. A lot of pressure is on the downstream, but in order for them to lower their footprint, in the light of the Scope 3 discussion... Yeah,
that's what I said.
Exactly.
That's the Scope 3, that's the farmers...
Absolutely. You're catching on quite quickly. But for them to reduce that footprint, they need to incentivize their upstream, their suppliers, to lower their footprint. So, that comes with a value.
Yeah, and data can help with that then.
Absolutely, because also for them, if they want to make a claim, they need to substantiate it. If their sustainability data is audited, then it needs to be the right data, it needs to be precise, direct, accurate, verified. Data is quite key.
Yeah, I understand. So, and then where to start as a company? Are there any tools that you can use, or?
There's a lot of tools, and I think in starting, there's a couple of things that you can do. And first and foremost, I think you need to approach it from the perspective of an ecosystem. Due to that Scope 3, you're all in the same boat, so you cannot do that in isolation. And I think the second part that we also touched upon is, the credibility of your data. So, how are you then going to look for the right tool? It needs to be a tool that takes the interests of the value chain into account, both the downstream and the upstream. Second, you need a tool that can work with direct data that is in line with the latest rules and regulations. And an example, we're here in a DSM-Firmenich context. If you look at the Sustel tool that DSM has developed, that's in collaboration with the industry, so it serves the interests along the value chain, and it can tap into the needs of the downstream as well as the upstream, and it's a tool that is fully EU PEF compliant, which is, let's say, the umbrella for most of the criteria that you'll face. So that would be an example of a great tool to use.
Yeah, a good start to
Yeah,
start with those
definitely,
that tool. Yeah, and like to follow up. So where to start? How do companies implement all this? Do you have any tips?
Absolutely, and I think there's two main things to think about. First and foremost, you're all in the same boat together. Due to that Scope 3 data imperative, you'll have to collaborate, you'll have to jointly think about how to solve this issue. And the second point that's equally important is you'll have to start now. And there's different forces at work. If you look, for instance, at that food chain and you look at the downstream, there you'll have the big companies, they're close to the heat, close to the fire, close to the consumers. There's a big potential for value capture at that end. So they're working on this. But equally, for the upstream, you'll also have to start thinking about it today because you are sitting on the data that enables this all. You have all the data assets, so the value creation is happening at the upstream. So there's an equal interest there, and also the upstream shouldn't wait for the pressure to trickle down, but they should really think about, well, how can we make this work in such a way that it covers our interests as well? So if you collaborate, then there's opportunities at the downstream and at the upstream, and together you really need to think about how to shape this ecosystem in a sustainable way, and you have to start thinking about that now because this is not something that you'll want to be sleeping on.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for being here and sharing your insights with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching Future Feed Talks. If you want to see more episodes or listen to our podcast, please click on the links below.